Perfect.
So, good evening, everybody. It might be a bit boring introduction for some of you who have been coming in for the last 5 days. It's going to be something similar. So, my name is Chavez. I'm the founder of One Stop Borneo Wildlife. It's a conservation organization based in Sabah and Brunei. I'm also an administrator to Borneo Mammals Club, which is on Facebook. Basically, Borneo Mammals Club is a community of mammal lovers, researchers, photographers, people who have visited Borneo, people who want to learn about mammals and so on. So that's it's basically a community, and there's so many interesting people on the Facebook group. So everybody works on something different. Some on marine mammals, some on pangolin, some on carnivores. Some are from Sarawak, some are from Kalimantan. So we basically decided this week is going to be a week of people sharing their interesting projects, and we have had a good crowd this week and some loyal crowd of many people who have been joining for the past week. So Susan is based in Kalimantan, and I actually don't know Susan so well, but I actually know her for 15 years almost now. Even in high school and university times, when we were doing our projects, and we would take images from Google and so on. At that time, I would always see her name there, and then from archive and so on. So now I'm very happy that finally I meet her. So I'm so looking forward. So I hope you forgive me, Susan, for taking your images in my high school projects. I'm
Not a
admitting it now.
problem. Happy to help.
Well, it made me love clouded leopards even more, and animals like that even more. So yeah, so it worked out a little bit, I guess so, for something. Okay, I'm gonna hand over to Susan, and she can do a better introduction of herself and her organization and today's idea. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, you've disabled screen sharing, Chavez. You need
Okay,
to
let
make me
me.
a host.
Okay, just a second. Okay, try now.
Yep.
Everyone, please mute yourself for now, and we will have a discussion later. Thank you.
Okay, folks. Good evening, good afternoon. I hope everybody can hear me, and I hope you can all see the screen. If you can't, please unmute yourself and tell me that we have a problem, but I hope our technology is going to stay with us. Yes, my name is Susan Chain. I'm a co-director of the Borneo Nature Foundation, and we've been working in central Kalimantan for the last 20 years. We've been working to protect landscapes and wildlife, and I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through some of the activities that we're doing with a focus on the mammals and the types of activities that we're doing. And I have got some videos, so I very much hope they're going to work. So this first slide work, that's excellent. What you can see here is a map of peatland and peat swamp forest in Indonesia and Malaysian Borneo. And what we can see here is it's quite extensive areas of peatland. And the areas that I'm specifically going to be talking about are the Sabangau forest and then the Rungan landscape, but I'll show this in more detail later. It shows you that we still have a vast area of peatland that we can protect, even though we have lost a great deal over the past decades. So obviously the flagship species that we are working on is the Bornean orangutan, but we've taken an approach where we're trying to study as many of mammals and indeed all biodiversity as far as we possibly can, with the idea that studying a single mammal is not enough to actually protect an ecosystem. You have to understand the interactions between all the wildlife. And although I'll focus on mammals today, I will highlight some of the other species that we're working on. Obviously, again, another flagship species is the other Asian ape, the gibbon. We're also focusing on the red langur, which is an endemic monkey to Borneo. And as well as that, we're doing a lot of things with invertebrates. I will mention some of the mammals, but we're looking at frogs, we're looking at praying mantis, birds, caterpillars, butterflies, dragonflies, and we did do a study on I've mentioned butterflies, I think, as well. So we're really trying to get a very broad understanding of the ecosystem, but equally we have to understand its threats. So here's a short video for you, just a couple of minutes, and it seems to be working. Oh. So that just gives you a brief overview of some of the work BNF is doing, but I'm going to go into that in more detail. Now, Borneo is hugely important in terms of biodiversity. 15,000 species of flowering plants, totaling the global 4%, 3,000 tree species, 222 mammals, 420 bird species, which is 5% of global total, and 19 non-human primates, many of which are endemic, so they're only found on the island of Borneo, which makes them of even greater conservation value. So the three locations that BNF works in are a combination of peat swamp forest, lowland dipterocarp, and montane forest. And we have taken on these three sites geographically almost in a straight line, which wasn't entirely intentional. And we've looked at the different problems, the different habitats, and also the different threats that these three habitats face. And so we're trying to protect these. And a large part of that is understanding the biodiversity, the guild of mammals that actually exists in each of these different areas. Of course, of the threats, we know that particularly for cats, and indeed for other species, hunting is a problem. Extraction of animals such as monkeys, apes, and sun bears for pets is a particular problem. Increasingly, we're seeing the pet trade moving online to platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. We've got illegal logging continuing. Extraction of timber is a massive problem, particularly where clear felling happens and there is not considered sustainable extractive timber. Fragmentation of the habitat, and particularly for peat swamp forest, we've got a couple of very unique problems whereby canals are cut into the forest floor, which then drain the peat. Now, obviously, peat should be wet, and wet peat is sustainable and maintains the ecosystem. Dry peat burns. We have conversion, as we saw in the video, of pristine rainforest to monoculture, such as acacia or palm oil plantations. This is an example of one of the canals in the forests in Sabangao, so our southernmost site, the peat swamps site. And huge volumes of water are drained out the peat every day, really causing problems for the hydrological balance of the forest. Again, examples of canals in degraded land where you've not only got drainage of the water table, but you'll also have problems with soil stability. And as the soil becomes less stable around the canal, then you start to lose trees. You get increased tree fall and gap falling, and this opens up the area, and you get problems with forest regeneration. Now, fire is a massive problem, particularly on peat swamp, and unfortunately, Indonesia is particularly susceptible to fires every year. It's almost an annual event. And we suspect that we should be getting fires starting in the forests and where BNF works probably in the next couple of weeks, unfortunately. It's worsening. There are trends that are continuing, and while we used to see fire events every couple of years, it is now an annual event. It's associated with dry weather in El Nino years. There was a huge problem with fires in 1997 to 98. And we've seen increasing frequency of these El Nino events, with the results, as I said, that we now have almost annual fires. And when El Nino was particularly strong, as it was in 2015, the fires are exceptionally bad, as is the smoke that the fires produce. As you can see, again, these are examples from very near to the BNF base camp in Sabangao. Fires raging on the left, and then the resulting degraded land on the right. Again, this is drone footage from very near to our base camp, where we saw significant fire events and a large chunk of forest burned. And while you do get trees remaining in burnt areas, the problem is that then when regeneration happens, you start to get ferns and pandan and potentially invasive species coming back, the species that can come back far more quickly and generate more quickly, which means they stifle the growth of native tree species. So regeneration, natural regeneration following fires, is a big problem. This is just an example of what happens to the degraded burnt area following the fires in 2015. And of course, we know from work that we're doing that the orangutans and gibbons in particular are badly affected by the smoke. Not surprisingly, if they're having to breathe in this toxic atmosphere in the same way that it causes human respiratory problems, it causes respiratory problems for the orangutans and gibbons. They significantly reduce the calling frequency. They significantly reduce the amount of times that they call. And this, of course, has an impact on their social behavior and their ability to defend territories. And of course, the human toll on this again is very poorly understood. But of course, it must, if humans are being badly affected, then of course the wildlife is as well. And just an example from 2015, as you can see, a hazardous rating is 350 parts per million. And in Palankaraya, on this one day in September 2015, it was 1,575 parts per million, so almost 5 times the most hazardous rating. So it really is this this air, the concentration parts is really toxic, and we don't fully understand the impact on wildlife yet. So I am supposed to be talking about mammals, so I will move swiftly on to that. Whilst I have presented a fairly depressing picture, I hope to leave you with some hope at the end of some of the things that BNF is doing with our many partners in order to be able to tackle these problems. So we have identified that our various sites. The peat swamp forest only has 4 of the 5 cats. We've not found the bay cat in the peat swamp, but we found the bay cat in our middle sites in the lowland dipterocarp forest. And we're going to be starting camera trapping up in the mountain in the next few months. So we're very excited about that. We were the first group to discover that we had a substantial population of clouded leopards living in Indonesian peat swamp forest in Kalimantan. This is Stratus. This is one of our top adult males. From this, we've discovered a lot of information about male overlap, territory use, tenure for how long males remain in a particular area. However, we are significantly lacking data on females. For some reason, out of all the trapping individuals that we've caught on camera since 2008, we've got 11 males and only 1 female. So something very strange is happening with the females, and it could be down to our trapping effort. We have various hypotheses as to why this might be. It could be that females are avoiding areas where there's an intensive presence of researchers. It could be that there's a particularly high density of males, which you would think might attract the females. Or perhaps females are simply more arboreal. And because most of our cameras up until recently were on the ground, we simply weren't catching the females. We've got the flat-headed cat. Despite numerous efforts of capturing images of the flat-headed cat, I've never got a particularly perfect image. But you can tell this is a flat-headed cat. Again, the sort of flattened face and the very short tail. I hope you can see the marbled cat in this picture, demonstrating very carefully, very cleverly the camouflage. And we discovered we have a substantial population of them. And of course, the fairly ubiquitous leopard cat that we've got. Now, is this the video? No. We were very excited when in Rungan we discovered the bay cat. This confirmed that we had all 5 cats in that area. The area is not yet protected, but that's something that BNF is working with local communities in order to be able to do. So what we're looking at across Kalimantan, unfortunately, population trends of all the cats, apart from the leopard cat, are likely to be decreasing. We know the cats are affected by habitat fragmentation, but we're particularly lacking in a lot of population data for many of these species. We do have density data for the clouded leopard, but not for any of the other cats. So this is something that we are hoping to work on further in the future as we develop our cat conservation side of things, looking at the densities, looking at population trends, and looking at distribution of these cats. But particularly one of the exciting things is that when we discovered the bay cat in the Rungan area, we were actually able to show that the bay cat's distribution was a good 60 to 70 kilometers further south than what the IUCN map actually showed. So that increasing that distribution map is incredibly important. Another thing that's come out of work, and this is work that's been done in collaboration with the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford and colleagues in Sabah, is that connectivity for cats is particularly important. These are, especially a clouded leopard, is a relatively large, wide-ranging predator species. It's important that habitat connectivity is maintained to allow these cats to move frequently, to move freely, and to increase genetic dispersal. So this, again, creating corridors is another important part of the work that needs to be done. And again, if you're just focusing on an individual species within a landscape, it doesn't necessarily give you the full picture in terms of landscape conservation and landscape management. Another thing, obviously, we're looking at is that of the 3 sites that BNF works in, only 1 is actually a protected area as a national park. The other 2 sites have no protection. And of particular importance is looking at wildlife in non-protected areas. Understanding the biodiversity of these particular areas like Rungan and up in the mountain site in Barito Ulu, because we have significant chunks of unprotected forest where we can find viable populations of biodiversity. So it's especially important to not just focus on the easily accessible forests, but to get into these inaccessible areas and really try and understand what's happening with the wildlife and biodiversity within these areas. So some of the long-term data that we've been able to gather through BNF, this is probably the only stone in the entire peat swamp forest. It's called Bukit Jack, or Jack's Hill, and we get a lot of wildlife coming up here. Here's an excellent flanged male orangutan. And what we've been doing since 1996, when some of the team first went out to do orangutan nest surveys as part of their undergraduate degrees, is we actually have information about population trends, which is fantastic. Now, what you will see here, and hopefully this works, in 1997, in particular, illegal logging started because that was when the legal logging concession in Sabangao ended. And because there was no protection, illegal logging began. And we can actually link events, human influence, anthropogenic influence, with impacts on the orangutans. Then we had the forest fires of 97, 98. And what you see here, just to explain, is the different graphs. The overall population size is the black line. The other lines are giving an indication of population size in the 3 different sub-habitats that we have in Sabangao. These sub-habitats are quite different from each other, so it's important that when surveying a large area like Sabangao of 5,600 square kilometers, that you don't simply survey a small area and extrapolate. And then, so the tall interior forest in the center of the peat dome and the mixed swamp, which is around the forest edge, near the river, was started to get exploited. And then we saw a significant drop in the number of orangutans. Now, what we think happened is there was a combination of fires coming from the middle, an exploitation of the forest around the edges, and the orangutans were actually pushed into what we call the low interior forest, which is a particularly low productivity forest. Naturally, low productivity is where 2 peat domes meet. And we believe that this resulted in a population crash because the orangutans were compressed into this area that did not have enough resources to support the population. So in 2004, the area was declared a national park, and that's also when our partners at the University of Palangkaraya established a patrol team. Oops. And what you can see now is that whilst we don't believe numbers have gone back to what they were pre-exploitation, we are seeing an increase in the population, which is exciting, and it shows that our conservation efforts are working. Now, we don't have quite as long-term data for the gibbons, but we do have some. And again, you can look at the different habitat types, and again, we're starting to see a slow change in population numbers. We're seeing stability in some of the habitat subtypes, which is fantastic. But this also gives us an indication that perhaps the gibbons weren't as badly affected by the forest fires and the illegal logging as the orangutans were. Unfortunately, again, as I said, we've got about 10 years of data less for the gibbons, but again, long-term monitoring of these populations is important to be able to understand how anthropogenic disturbance affects them and how conservation action can hopefully help population recovery. What we see here, so the fires in 2015, we definitely, in that scrubby low interior forest, we definitely saw a population decrease, whereas in the other parts of the forest, happily, that didn't seem to happen. So we obviously want to survey as much of the wildlife as possible. And this has become increasingly easy to do because of camera traps. I love camera traps. I will talk about them all day, every day, if you are interested. I can talk about models and makes and survey design and you know, ones that work well in the forest and ones that don't. But the wonderful thing about camera traps is whilst we put them out with a focus on obtaining images of clouded leopards, the other animals that we get have given us a huge insight into the biodiversity of the different areas in which we're working. We've discovered that we've got troops of between 40 and 50 pigtail macaques wandering around the forest. We always knew that these groups were big, but we didn't have any proof until we actually get, you know, troops crossing paths, and you can actually sit and count the number of individuals within a particular troop. We've got information that the pigtail macaques, being a much more terrestrial species than the gibbons or orangutans or langurs, are significantly preferentially avoiding areas where clouded leopards have been. So if a clouded leopard passes by an area, you won't see pigtail macaques in that same area for a minimum of 5 days. So there's obviously this idea of a landscape of fear where the macaques are significantly avoiding areas where clouded leopards have previously been, which is fascinating and is something that has been played out with looking at baboons and leopards in South Africa. But more work is needed on this. As always, more work is needed. We've started putting cameras up into the canopy in the hope that we're going to find out if these female clouded leopards are up there. So far, we've got an exceptional array of particularly civets and birds that we don't normally get on the ground. We get increasingly curious pigtail macaques, obviously. And then we've started looking at sun bears. We're looking at population density and distribution of sun bears. We've been looking at when cubs are born, the frequency of cubs. Again, we've got data from 2008, which gives us an enormous amount of data to actually be able to work with, which is fascinating. We're also looking at, we've unfortunately seen a couple of bears with paws missing. So again, we're using that information to try and expand our survey and patrol areas, particularly looking out for snares. As you can see with the habitat, finding snares is particularly difficult in a peat swamp forest, and especially when it's flooded. Some of the other things that we've discovered, yellow-throated martens live in family groups. Fascinating. We've been able to contribute a lot of information to our understanding of many of the small carnivores that live in peat swamp forest. Interestingly, again, there's certain species that we would expect to find, and there's certain species that we simply have never encountered in 12 years now of camera trapping. As I said, the bay cat sadly appears to not be there. We don't have the Sunda stink badger, but we do have things like the black partridge. We don't have the great Argus pheasant. So it's very interesting what species are actually using the peat swamp and which species are, for ecological reasons, we assume, which are not. We've got greater and lesser mouse deer, we've got muntjacs, and we have sambar deer. So we have an excellent deer population, which can support so obviously ecological regeneration and presumably clouded leopards. Here's muntjacs. We've got plenty of civets, a Malay civet, for those of you who who are not quite sure what this is. We get plenty of these. We get images of them scent marking, which is fantastic. Again, we need to look at the information that we've got in order to try and get sort of population numbers, or at least an indication of occupancy. Bearded pigs, believed to be very, very widely spread across the island. However, of course, they're hunted and therefore sometimes overlooked when it comes to conservation. But what we're doing with the bearded pigs, again, we're looking at their occupancy, movement, seasonality of presence of the bearded pigs across different landscapes in Kalimantan, with the idea that potentially these are prey species, perhaps not a big pig, but you know, piglets might be. I certainly wouldn't want to take on an adult bearded pig, so maybe a clouded leopard would also be a bit wary about doing that too. Mongooses, never quite sure about that. Anyway, again, small carnivores that we've got a lot of information about, where we can identify numbers. We've got an idea about occupancy and how they use the landscape, which is fantastic. We have both collared and short-tailed mongoose. Storm stork, obviously not a mammal, I appreciate that, but we have got a substantial breeding population of storm storks. There's only meant to be maybe 400 breeding pairs in the whole world. So the fact that we've got regular encounters of storm storks in the peat swamp forest is really exciting for us, and gets the bird enthusiasts very excited. So bringing all of this together, we've got environmental issues, we've got human degradation, peatland degradation, anthropogenic impacts of peat drainage resulting in canals, or resulted from the canals, fire, carbon dioxide emissions, emissions of other gases from the peat. We have forest loss, degradation, and fragmentation. So how do we bring all of this together to actually form some sort of solution? Well, we've got habitat restoration, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a wee minute. Local development and education, working across schools, across all different ages with children, and of course with adults as well. Habitat protection, again, I'll talk a wee bit more about that shortly. And of course the research and the ecological monitoring that I've just talked about briefly with the mammal species that we are looking at. That underpins absolutely everything that we are actually doing. We need to understand the ecosystem and the wildlife within it in order to inform effective conservation actions. So one of the actions is we have dedicated firefighting teams that work to tackle the fires that happen on, as I said, on an almost annual basis. We do outreach and education to attempt to inform people about the problems of setting fires. Not all fires are man-made. Some fires occur naturally, but when the land is particularly dry, and then you are setting fires for clearing of ladangs, clearing of small areas of land, small farms, these fires will go out of control. And when you're sitting on peat that may be 3 to 5 meters deep, that's a lot of fuel that can burn, especially if that peat is dry because of canals. So understanding the broader picture is really important in terms of tackling this problem. Just as some examples, these are from 2015 of some of the teams out in the degraded areas tackling fires. This is them digging a bore down to the water table so that we can actually access water to fight the fire. This is difficult, dangerous, hard work. And we're incredibly lucky that through local groups, BNF supports about 150 firefighters, many of whom I should point out are in fact women, which is fantastic. And these teams are on standby during the fire season to leap into action so that we can protect as much forest as possible. Obviously, that's only one part of the problem, is tackling the fires. We've also got to do habitat restoration when it comes to blocking the canals. Some of these canals can be hundreds of kilometers long. As I said, Sabangau is 5,600 square kilometers. It's a large chunk of forest into which many canals have been cut over the last 30 years. And it's the only real way to restore natural hydrological balance in the battle to control fires is to block these canals. But what we've been doing over the years is coming up with different designs, and what we've finally come up with now is the design you see here. And you may question why we've got a gap in the middle. I hope you can see my mouse, perhaps not. The reason we have a gap in the middle is because through previous work that we've done looking at fish stocks, we actually have, what would normally happen is there would be ponds within the forest where fish would spawn. And then when the forest floods, these fish spawn would return to the main river channel. What seems to be happening now is the fish are breeding within the canals. And so we've created these little channels to allow fish to escape from the canals back into the main water channel to ensure we're perpetuating and maintaining fish stocks in the main river, because of course fishing is an incredibly important economic income for many of the people in the local community. We've been doing reforestation and restoration work since 2005, looking at growth rates, which species survive best under which kind of conditions, which species grow best under which kinds of conditions, identifying natural orders of succession based on what would happen in a naturally occurring gap in the forest, so that we can basically replicate natural succession as far as possible. Last year alone, we planted 50,000 seedlings, saplings. We're increasingly looking at seed dispersal using drones, additional seedling and sapling planting. We're in the middle of developing a campaign to ramp up the amount of reforestation that we actually do, which is very exciting. So yeah, this is our highlight nursery where we have different seedlings and saplings of different sizes and of different species that we know grow well, species that we know are important food species for the different primates and for the sun bears, so that we're creating a mosaic of different species when we replant. This is me with our patrol team, who are incredibly important in terms of protecting the forest, in terms of managing the area. This is with our local university counterparts as well. So the patrol team is absolutely crucial, our rangers who go out and actually protect the forest. With our education work, we do a lot of outreach with schools. We do a lot of outreach with our kids club, which is a weekly club. We invite the students to come to the forest. We have annual festivals where we invite the children to speak to the local communities about the things that they've learned, and we include within this cultural learning as well as learning about biodiversity. And we've now been doing this for about 5 years. So some of the priorities that we have are to maximize populations and also optimize law enforcement. Particularly, one key thing is stopping hunting, especially in non-protected areas. We need to stop or control habitat loss and forest conversion through habitat protection and increasing habitat connectivity, and that comes down to reforestation. Long-term population monitoring really is crucially important in order to be able to understand what impacts anthropogenic disturbance is having, but hopefully also what positive impacts conservation actions are having. And involving local people is absolutely critical. Communities involving outreach and education is, in our opinion, absolutely an absolute priority if you want to have an effective conservation project. So our outcomes: providing knowledge is essential for conservation management, and it has to be underpinned by clear, good science. We want to help deter illegal activities and provide data on the impact of such activities. So our patrol team uses spatial monitor and reporting tool to be able to assess the impact of their activities and monitor where illegal activities are taking place. And increase the capacity of local organizations to carry out conservation programs. So working with local universities, working with local NGOs, working with the national park in order to provide and increase their capacity. So my take-home messages are: we need many different approaches in order to be able to protect the landscapes. And some of that is absolutely critical when it comes to things like camera trapping, population monitoring of primates, and understanding how the wildlife actually use their habitat, but equally how that habitat is impacted by anthropogenic disturbance. And sharing experience and ideas is absolutely crucial to make this work and for this to be effective. So the final take-home message is keep our peat wet. Wet peat doesn't burn. And if there's no burning, there's no fires, there's no smoke, and there's better habitat protection. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan. If you could maybe stop sharing the screen for a while, and
Sure.
that would be great. Thank you so much, Susan. I learned a lot about Kalimantan and especially Borneo Nature Foundation. And I'm sure a lot of I think today is the biggest crowd we had. I think a lot of people were curious about Kalimantan as well, and your great work. So thank you so much. And now everybody the floor is going to be open for a discussion session. So there's one way to do this. You can type some of your questions, but what is preferred is if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can click this thumbs up, or I think under the participants you can raise your finger if you have any question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question. So yeah, the floor is yours. Everybody who wants to ask anything or say anything. Okay, Jess.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I work in Sabah, so it's really, but in the kind of lowland rainforest. So it's interesting to hear about the Karangas and the peat swamp forest. I've not yet managed to visit. I just wondered, when you were talking about clouded leopards and you've had a disproportionate number of male records, I wondered how you set your cameras, because I think I remember reading a paper by Ollie Wern a few years ago where he set cameras in a random design rather than on trails, and he seemed to find that, or his results suggested that perhaps females were avoiding trails and males used them more. I might have got that the wrong way around, but I just wondered if that might be anything to do with your records of females versus males.
Absolutely. So when we've been, yeah, Ollie's design was more randomized. Sabang has been fairly random because actually getting around a peat swamp forest is ridiculously difficult. So we have had some on trails. You possibly noticed one of the pictures, actually, the clouded leopard.
Susan, I think you have been cut, maybe due to technical issue. We'll wait for her to come back. By the way, welcome Dr. Olmar. Andrew, I think Andrew Hearn is here too, or I think so. That's what I saw at least. Andy, you're around? Okay. There's a question just now by HDA. Any good read for these topic, mammals of Borneo in particular? Yes, one book which I would suggest to you is get this book called A Field Guide to Mammals of Borneo by Quentin Phillips. It's the latest edition one, the 2018-2016 one. I think that will be very informative for you to learn about mammals of Borneo in general. So it's great. We'll wait for Susan. Let's see what other question is there. Bichu has a question. Do you have anyone? Okay, now this question I think we'll wait for Susan to come back. Anirol on stealing cameras. Okay, let's see. We'll have to wait for that. Christian, do you know if you could potentially answer that question by Jess, as you work with covered leopards, or Andy, if you're still around?
Well, if Andy isn't here, I can just offer the little that I know about it. So I think Andy did do a randomized design as well, as per Andy Wern's suggestion in his paper. And there wasn't a significant increase in female detections despite the randomized design. And there was a much lower detection rate compared to the males and females. I think, was that the question? Because I didn't hear it super clear.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. It was just wondering whether Susan had set her cameras only on trails, because that might possibly be a reason why they were detecting more males than females. But yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you check the Andrew Hearn's papers in 2015, 16, and 17 on the density estimates of cloud leopards. It was also designed for the marble cat and the bay cat and the clouded leopard. But for the cloud leopard, there was still a lot less detection of females still. So the randomized design did help, but it wasn't. It didn't answer the question entirely.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a look at those.
Cool.
Susan's Wi-Fi has died. That's what she said. See what she can say. Okay, while waiting for her, let's wait for another few minutes for her. Maybe we all can. Honey Roll, you have a question, but I won't answer on her behalf. But your question is, hi Susan, did you ever have any serious issues with poachers? Did they ever steal your camera traps? Maybe other people from here could share the experience if other people have had lost camera traps. We have had few cameras stolen by poachers, even sometimes by rangers, because they were doing hanky-panky stuff. And by local tourists, actually, we have had camera traps stolen as well. So others, have you guys have any bad experience with camera traps being stolen in the field? Ian has a question. Given the importance of habitat connectivity, are you camera trapping in plantations and other land use areas, whether they're utilized by any species being utilized? Okay. Ian, I would love to talk more about my work, but Susan is back. So we'll let Susan join. Hi, Susan, are you here?
I'm back. I'm back. Sorry about that.
No worries. Don't worry.
The Wi-Fi went down, so I've connected my phone.
No worries. We had Christian answer from his experience, and so you can continue if you want, if you remember your last point.
Yes. So yeah, it was to answer Jess's question about the distribution of cameras. They were in a grid, apart from in Sabangau, where they were placed anywhere we could actually get access to. But the idea was they were a minimum of 500 meters to a kilometer apart. But they weren't as randomized a design as what Ollie Warren did. But that absolutely could be one of the reasons why we're not getting as many females. But interestingly, we got of the other grids that we did in East and Central Kalimantan, the pattern of getting more males than females bore out. So there's definitely something interesting going on there.
Yeah, Christian was just actually saying in your absence that I think Andy Hearn found similar. So, I mean, maybe it is actually a pattern, an overall pattern. And I just had one other comment. Thank you very much for your answer. So we've been in contact as well because we're both doing a bit of arboreal camera trapping. So just as a comment from my sites in Sabah, I haven't yet had any detections, much to my disappointment, of clouded leopards in the canopy. So I had about 20 detections overall on the ground and nothing in the canopy. And I think that it might be due to partly low density. And I think also it might be due to the fact that I was setting my cameras in the very high canopy, whereas I feel like maybe clouded leopards might be targeting larger branches or perhaps vine tangles or something kind of lower down. So I just, it was sort of more of a comment really, and I'll be interested to hear, what you find in terms of in the canopy in the peat forest.
Yeah, the only time we've actually seen a clouded leopard up in the peat swamp was when a group of gibbons had an interaction with the clouded leopard. The clouded leopard was minding its own business, and the gibbons had to go at it. So if you want, I mean, I think we did a brief report about that, but that's the only sighting. And again, the cloudy was kind of in the bore of the tree, so where the main branches branched out. So it wasn't particularly high. Our cameras are at about 12 to 18 meters at most. But we've never caught any cloudies on the camera traps. I said the only sighting we actually got was during a gibbon follow when the gibbons interacted with the cloudy.
That must have been amazing to see.
Yes, it was. It's just, especially because one of the younger gibbons swung on the clouded leopard's tail.
Wow, there was a physical interaction. Wow.
Yes, there was.
And how did the leopard respond?
I was a bit worried for the young gibbon in case the clouded leopard was going to turn around and just grab him.
Did you get that on
Like
film?
pulling out the Jungle Book.
I think they watched
We
Tom
don't
and
have it on
Jerry.
film. Oh no, we do have it on film. Hang on, let me see if I can find the video on our YouTube channel. I'm happy to answer. Sorry, are there any more questions in the
Yes,
chat?
just to add to Jess, recently there have been some clouded leopards being spotted in Sabah, and they were quite in the understory layer, not too high. Yeah, so that's interesting. Jack, we'll come to you later. We just have a long list of questions. There was a question by HDA saying, any good read for these topic mammals in Borneo? So I just suggested and recommended Mammals of Borneo by Quentin Phillips. If you have something else to recommend, great. Bichu has a question for you, Susan. Do you have anyone working on fish species in peat swamp forest at your research site?
Yes, we do. We've done a fair bit of quite a lot of work on peat swamp fish, particularly looking at what the biodiversity of the fish is, but also which fish are most not commercially, but which fish are most important economically for local people. Again, if people want to send me an email, I can send you the papers that we've published about this, or I can send you a link to the video of the clouded leopard and the gibbon.
Maybe you can put the video link in the chat box. Again.
Yep, I'm just looking for it now.
Okay, fantastic. Another question for you, Susan, by Honey Roll from Brunei is: Do you ever had any serious issues with poachers? Did they ever steal your camera traps?
Fortunately, I have not had any issues with theft, apart from when we did some work in Kutai National Park in East Kalimantan. Lost 6 cameras. So actually, one of the most protected sites was the area where we lost the most camera traps. I've lost more cameras to sun bears and orangutans than I have to people.
That's good to know. Question by Ian Redman. Given the importance of habitat connectivity, are you camera trapping in plantations and other land use areas to see whether they're utilized by any species being studied?
We are, so our middle site, Rungan, we are camera trapping in degraded fire areas, in areas that have been previously logged, and we are seeking permission to be able to put cameras into plantations. So we don't yet have cameras in plantations, but we're trying to communicate with the companies to see if that's something that they would allow us to do.
Ian, we put some camera traps, not in well, we did put some in plantations, but we put at the forest edge with the plantation, where we have regularly sighted marble cats and leopard cats, quite commonly actually. I think they're going for the rats and everything, but good luck, Susan, with that. Christian also sent a link of the article he was talking about, very nice link. I'll also open that. Let's see, does anybody else have a question? Okay. We'll go for Jack's question first. Jack, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, sure. It was really interesting. You mentioned, Susan, that something about the overlap in the tenures of the clouded leopard males. Are you able to go into a bit of detail with that? Because it sounds interesting.
Yeah, so all of the, we don't have all of the 11 males that we've identified. They're not all identified throughout the entire 12 years that we've been doing the camera trapping. They are, I think we normally have about 4 or 5 who are sort of tenured at any one time, and then the cohort kind of changes over. The details of that I can send to you because it was published in Cat News, which I will just have a look for and send you the link. Can I upload attachments, does anyone know, to Zoom?
I have no idea. I just know in the chat box, I think you can put in any link, I think.
Oh, yeah, I seem to be able, I've just found file. All right,
yes,
bear
file.
with me and I will upload the file for you.
While uploading, there's a question by Cock on Ku. He says, the cloudy on canopy, are they female or both sex? Does anybody know the answer to this?
The female is, sorry, the clouded leopard in the interaction is male. The clouded leopard that had the interaction with gibbons is male.
Very nice. Okay, wait, I'm saving that document. Okay, Matt Wisden has a question. Could you go into a bit more detail about how tree and plant species are selected for reforestation and replanting?
Yes. Several things. One is we look at natural succession in the forest itself, where there's been a natural tree fall, and we look at what species come in. So we've got an idea of what the natural succession order should be. Secondly, we plant a bunch of seedlings in 4 different conditions: dry peat, wet peat, normal peat, flooded peat, peat with additional mycorrhizae, and peat with additional phosphorus and nitrogen. And we look at which of these conditions the seeds germinate best in. And once we've got an idea of which seeds germinate best under which conditions, that's the conditions under which we then plant, multiple seeds of that species. We also look at trying to get a balance between species that can potentially grow quickly, species that will survive being planted out in the degraded area where there's no shade, and also species that are important for the primates to consume, so fruit species. But we also look at planting gelatum rubber trees. I don't remember the Latin name, or I can't pronounce the Latin name, because these can be sustainably tapped by local people for rubber. So if we're trying to create a buffer zone around the remaining forest, these are the kinds of trees that we're trying to focus on.
As we are talking about reforestation, Susan, have you ever thought of or are planting figs?
We have tried to germinate figs, and it's incredibly difficult in animal feed.